Welcome to Life Stories, where we dive into real, raw, and inspiring journeys that show the power of resilience and self-discovery. Today, we share the story of Sophie Matthews, a woman who had everything: wealth, status, and a seemingly perfect life, until betrayal shattered her world. But instead of crumbling, Sophie took control of her destiny and rebuilt her life stronger than ever. Her journey is a testament to the power of self-worth, trust, and the strength to rise above the darkest moments. Subscribe to our channel now to begin today's powerful story. It was a day that glittered with grandeur, Sophie's wedding day. The grand ballroom in New York City's exclusive Plaza Hotel sparkled with the light of golden chandeliers. Their soft glow reflected off the crystal-clear walls of the glass dome above, adding an ethereal touch to the opulent venue. Rows of pristine white roses lined the aisle, their sweet fragrance intermingling with the delicate scent of jasmine candles. Every detail, from the velvet-lined chairs to the intricate decorations, screamed opulence. And yet, despite all of this, Sophie had insisted on keeping things simple. She wasn't one for excess. Though today, her family's legacy demanded it. She sat alone in her bridal suite, her hands neatly folded in her lap, gazing at her reflection in the mirror. The soft lighting highlighted the elegant lace patterns of her gown, which shimmered slightly as she moved. A tiara rested atop her head, though it seemed almost unnecessary for a woman who naturally carried an air of royalty. Her skin, dark and radiant, glowed under the soft light, and her brown eyes reflected a mix of calm and quiet determination. Her best friend, Chloe, stood behind her, adjusting the train of her dress. "Sophie, you're getting married," she said, her voice light but laced with curiosity. "Why aren't you more excited?" Sophie looked up at Chloe, her lips curving into a small smile. "Excitement isn't the word I would use," she replied softly. "It's a responsibility, one I can't avoid." Chloe frowned, sensing the sadness in her friend's voice. "You don't have to do this. You know," she said, her tone turning serious. "Your wealth doesn't define you. You're more than that." Sophie's expression softened, but she interrupted Chloe gently, yet firmly. "We've talked about this," she said. "It's tradition. My family expects this." And he said yes. Chloe sighed and stepped back, her concern still etched on her face. "Fine, but I'm not convinced that Ethan deserves you. He seems too smooth. He doesn't even seem real." A faint smile curved Sophie's lips. "That's because he isn't," she said softly. "But he's perfect for what I need right now." She knew that the words felt hollow. They weren't what she truly wanted to believe, but they were the truth she had to face. Before Chloe could press further, there came a knock at the door. It was the wedding coordinator, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest, her voice trembling slightly with the usual anxiety that accompanied such important events. "It's time, Miss Sophie," she said. Sophie stood gracefully, smoothing the front of her gown. She turned to Chloe, her voice calm. "Let's go." Downstairs, the ballroom buzzed with energy. Guests, a mix of influential businessmen, politicians, and celebrities, mingled beneath the glow of the chandeliers. The orchestra played a soothing melody, their music weaving seamlessly into the hum of conversations and clinking glasses. Sophie felt a twinge of discomfort at the sight of so many people, all of whom were here for her, yet none of whom truly knew her. None of them knew the turmoil she was experiencing on the inside. Ethan stood near the altar, adjusting his crisp black tuxedo for the 5th time, his smile dazzling but his eyes betraying his true emotions. His posture was relaxed, but his mind raced as he scanned the room. This was it. This was the life he had always dreamed of. Standing at the altar, he was about to marry a woman with more wealth, more power, than most could ever imagine. He didn't love her, but that didn't matter. Next to him, his best man, Ryan, smirked knowingly. "You sweating, Vic?" he teased. "Cold feet already?" Ethan chuckled, though there was a nervous edge to his voice. "Not at all," he replied, masking his anxiety with forced confidence. "Just soaking it all in. Can you believe this? Look at this place. Look at these people. It's like stepping into a dream." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "A dream where you marry a billionaire?" Ethan leaned in closer, his grin widening. I told you I'd pull it off. Didn't I? Just charm and patience. That's all it takes. Ryan gave him a sideways glance. And love? Ethan hesitated, but only for a moment. Of course, he said, trying to convince himself more than Ryan. Love, she's special. Before Ryan could respond, the orchestra changed its tune. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned toward the grand staircase. Sophie appeared at the top. Each step she took deliberate and elegant. She moved as though she owned the world, and in many ways. She did. Ethan's jaw tightened as he watched her descend the stairs. She was stunning, but it wasn't just her beauty that captivated him. It was the power, the wealth, the status she represented. As she reached the altar, their eyes met briefly. There was a flicker of something unreadable in her gaze, calm, calculated, but not cold. She turned to the officiant, nodding subtly for the ceremony to begin. The vows were exchanged smoothly. Ethan's words, laced with sincerity, made the guests swoon, moved by the emotion in his voice as he pledged to love, honor, and cherish Sophie. But Sophie, as always, was careful. Her vows were spoken softly, but each word was carefully chosen, as though she were signing a contract, not professing love. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted into applause. Ethan leaned in to kiss her, his lips brushing hers gently. To the audience, it was the perfect moment of romance. But to Sophie, it was merely a necessary formality, a public performance she had to get through. At the reception, Ethan played the role of the doting husband flawlessly. He held Sophie's hand as they greeted guests, laughed at the jokes made by the older businessmen, and danced with her under the watchful eyes of the crowd. But when no one was looking, his eyes often wandered, lingering on the glittering jewels around Sophie's neck or the way her family's influential friends treated her with such respect. Sophie, meanwhile, smiled faintly, but her mind was elsewhere. The man beside her was charming. Yes, but he was a man playing a game. And for Sophie, it wasn't about the game. It was about what came next. As the night wore on, the energy in the ballroom remained electric. But Sophie found herself slipping deeper into her own thoughts. Ethan was playing the perfect role, charming, attentive, affectionate, but it was all an act. She knew this. She could feel it in the way he touched her, the way he spoke. The warmth in his words was often laced with a cold calculation. She had heard rumors, seen the way his eyes lingered a little too long on her wealth and status. She had no illusions about the man she had married. Ethan had never been in love with her. He loved what she could provide, what her name meant, and most of all, what her inheritance could offer him. Later that evening, as they sat in a quiet corner of the reception, Sophie's instincts began to take over. Ethan was sitting close to her, his arm draped around her waist. But his mind seemed far away. He kept glancing at his phone, his fingers tapping nervously on the glass. And each time his gaze shifted to the screen, Sophie felt a knot tightening in her stomach. Something wasn't right. She had married Ethan for the sake of her family's legacy, to uphold traditions and fulfill obligations. But she never anticipated that his ambition would betray her trust so early in their marriage. The doubts gnawed at her, and she found herself wishing, not for the first time, that she had known the real man behind the charming smile. The man who had promised to love her but never truly saw her. It wasn't long before Sophie's suspicion reached a breaking point. As the night came to a close, Ethan whispered in her ear, telling her how much he couldn't wait to join her on their honeymoon. Sophie smiled politely, masking the unease that crept into her heart. She knew it wasn't going to happen. She had felt the tension in his voice when he spoke about the urgent work he needed to handle. His story was too rehearsed, too convenient. Ethan had an escape plan, and it wasn't to be by her side. Sophie was certain now that he had someone else. The next morning, Sophie was already at the airport. She sat in the VIP lounge, her eyes darting over her phone, trying to quiet the storm of questions swirling in her mind. Her thoughts were interrupted by a message from Chloe, her best friend. "Are you sure you're okay with Ethan staying behind?" the message read. Sophie stared at it for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keys. The uncertainty inside her was growing, and she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was amiss. Sophie replied with a simple, "It's fine. If it's really work, I understand, but I'm not sure I believe him." She hesitated, then added, "Do you want me to check on him?" Her instincts were right. She wasn't going to just let it go. Ethan's behavior didn't sit right. And Sophie wasn't about to let herself be deceived. Not when the stakes were so high. She needed answers. Later that day, Sophie hired a private investigator. She wasn't sure what she was expecting to find. But deep down, she knew the truth was more than just a gut feeling. She needed proof. Proof of Ethan's disloyalty. His betrayal. The investigator's name was Thomas Carter, and he was a sharp, experienced man. Sophie had chosen him for his reputation in uncovering the truth. No matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. They met at a small cafe in a quiet corner of the city, far from the prying eyes of her elite circle. As she sat across from him, Sophie kept her emotions in check. She needed to remain composed, to focus on what she needed to learn. She explained everything to Carter, the odd behavior, the strange work emergency, and the growing sense of dread that had consumed her since their wedding day. She finished her story, her voice steady, but her heart racing inside her chest. "I need to know the truth," Sophie said firmly. "I can't live with this uncertainty anymore." Carter nodded, taking down some notes. "I understand, Mrs. Matthews," he said. "I'll get to work right away. If your husband is up to something, I'll find out." Sophie thanked him, her mind already racing with the possibilities. She knew she had to act quickly. She could feel Ethan slipping away. And the thought of losing him, or perhaps more accurately, the life she had built with him, was too painful to ignore. But deep down, she knew that what was at stake wasn't just her marriage. It was her peace of mind. It was her future, one she would no longer allow to be clouded by doubt and deceit. She left the cafe with a sense of resolve. Sophie was no longer waiting for answers, she was taking control of the situation. The days following her meeting with the investigator were a blur. Sophie tried to keep her mind distracted with walks on the beach and reading by the pool. But her thoughts always drifted back to Ethan. Each passing moment, each polite smile from him when he checked in via text, felt more like a hollow gesture. He wasn't the man she thought he was. As much as she had tried to convince herself otherwise. The evidence was there, building up like a storm on the horizon. Sophie's mind raced, but she kept her cool. She had always been taught to control her emotions, especially in moments of crisis. Her family's legacy depended on her ability to act with grace and decisiveness. And that's exactly what she did. After a long night of reflection, Sophie knew she couldn't let this slide any longer. It was time to take control of the narrative. Time to protect herself and her inheritance from Ethan's treachery. She reached out to her lawyer, Madison Hayes, a woman who had been a trusted advisor to her family for years. Madison's calm demeanor and sharp mind were exactly what Sophie needed in this moment. The lawyer's office was sleek, modern, and filled with the scent of polished wood and leather, an environment where business was done and secrets were safely guarded. Sophie met with her in private, sitting across from her at a large, polished desk. "I need you to help me secure my future, Madison," Sophie began, her voice steady but urgent. "Ethan is not who he appears to be. I need to make sure my assets are protected before things escalate any further." Madison nodded, her sharp eyes scanning Sophie's face. "I understand, Sophie. You've come to the right place. We'll take action, and we'll do it swiftly." The conversation turned to the specifics, her inheritance, the properties she had inherited from her family, and the assets that were now at risk. Madison suggested that Sophie establish a trust to keep her assets out of Ethan's reach. With a prenup already in place, Sophie's wealth was protected in principle. But Madison explained that securing everything in a trust would give Sophie ultimate control. "No one, not even Ethan, will have access to your wealth without your consent," Madison assured her. Sophie felt a sense of relief settle over her. But the weight of the situation was not lost on her. She was taking a stand, not just against Ethan, but against a system that had expected her to simply follow tradition without question. She was no longer willing to be a pawn in someone else's game. Her decisions, her future, would be her own to shape. As they discussed the finer details, Sophie's mind was already turning to the next step. She wanted to file for divorce. She knew she couldn't live with Ethan's betrayal. But more importantly, she knew that she deserved more than what he was offering. He didn't love her, he loved what she could provide. Madison listened carefully to Sophie's wishes, her professional demeanor never wavering. We'll start the annulment proceedings immediately. Ethan's infidelity gives us strong grounds for divorce. And with your assets secured, we'll ensure that he can't touch a single penny of your wealth. She explained. Sophie nodded, feeling a strange sense of empowerment. She had spent years of her life building her family's legacy, and she wasn't about to let anyone, least of all Ethan, tear it apart. Do it, Madison, she said, her voice firm. I want him out of my life. And I want to make sure he knows that everything he tried to take from me is off limits. Madison smiled faintly. We'll make sure that happens. And you'll walk away from this stronger than ever. As Sophie left the lawyer's office that day, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She wasn't just protecting her inheritance anymore, she was taking control of her own destiny. Ethan had thought he could outsmart her. But she wasn't the naive woman he had married. She had learned, and she would make sure that no one, especially Ethan, could ever take advantage of her again. The plan was set in motion. And Sophie knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But she was ready. And no matter what happened, she would not let Ethan or anyone else determine her future. This was her story, and she would write it on her own terms. The night of Sophie's planned public exposure arrived. And it was like a storm gathering on the horizon, ready to break. The ballroom at her family's estate was stunning. As expected, gold-rimmed chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm, soft glow on the carefully decorated tables below. Influential figures from every corner of New York society were in attendance, business moguls, politicians, celebrities, and media personalities, all there to honor Sophie's legacy and celebrate her inheritance. To the outside world, this was just another glamorous event in a life that seemed perfect from the outside. But Sophie had other plans. This night wasn't just about the celebration of her family's wealth. It was about confronting the betrayal that had been quietly festering beneath the surface of her marriage to Ethan. As the evening progressed, Sophie remained composed, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the palpable buzz in the room. She noticed Ethan near the center of the room, surrounded by guests and talking animatedly with some of the businessmen, his usual confident smile plastered on his face. Beside him was Chloe, his mistress, who was dressed in a fiery red gown. Her presence undeniable. Sophie's sharp eyes never missed a detail. And every glance from Ethan toward Chloe confirmed what she had already known. The man standing beside her wasn't the man she had married. He was a liar, a manipulator, and worse, a man who had no respect for her or their vows. Sophie could feel the knot tightening in her chest. This wasn't just about wealth or status anymore, it was about respect, trust, and integrity. Ethan had violated every sacred promise they had made. And Sophie knew it was time to expose him for who he really was. The guests were settling into their seats for dinner when Sophie stood up, her graceful movements commanding attention. The room quieted almost immediately. She raised her glass, tapping it gently with a spoon to capture everyone's focus. When she spoke, her voice was steady, yet every word carried the weight of the truth she was about to reveal. Good evening, everyone, Sophie began, her gaze sweeping across the room. Thank you for joining me tonight to celebrate not only my family's legacy but also the responsibility that comes with it. A polite round of applause followed. But Sophie didn't falter. She allowed the applause to die down before continuing. Her eyes locked on Ethan, who was sitting across the table, his face a mask of false warmth. Trust, she said, her voice growing stronger, is the foundation of any meaningful relationship. Whether in business, friendship, or marriage. Ethan's smile remained, but Sophie could see the subtle flicker of unease in his eyes. He didn't know what was coming. And yet, Sophie continued, her gaze still fixed on him. Trust is so often broken by those we least expect. The room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's expression shifted slightly, but he quickly recovered, his nervous chuckle trying to deflect the tension Sophie was creating. But tonight, Sophie said, her voice cold and clear, I'd like to share something important with you all. She motioned to one of the staff members, who placed a small speaker on the table. Before I continue, Sophie said, I want everyone to hear a few conversations that I've recorded. These are conversations between my husband and me. I believe they'll shed light on the topic of trust. Ethan's face turned pale, his eyes wide as the first conversation began to play. His voice, smooth and confident, filled the room. I think we should transfer some of the properties into both our names. That way, I can help you manage them. It'll make things easier for you. And there are tax benefits, too. The guests were stunned, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disbelief as the recording continued. Ethan's attempts to manipulate Sophie were laid bare for all to hear. But it wasn't just his greed that was exposed. His cold, calculating tone, the way he treated Sophie as nothing more than a means to an end, sent a wave of shock through the crowd. As the first recording ended, Sophie pressed another button, and the second conversation began. This time, Ethan's voice was joined by Chloe's. She's too sweet and naive to even imagine what's going on right now, Ethan said, his words dripping with disdain. She's probably sipping cocktails at the resort, waiting for me to join her. She has no idea. Chloe's voice followed, sharp and mocking. You'd better make it convincing. If she even suspects what you're up to, you'll lose everything. Gasps rippled through the room. The faces of the guests turned from surprise to disgust. As they pieced together the layers of deceit, Ethan's jaw dropped, and Chloe, pale and visibly shaken, stood up, her hand trembling as she tried to speak. Sophie, she began, but Sophie silenced her with a sharp wave of her hand. No, Sophie said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Your words mean nothing. You've betrayed me, both of you. The silence in the room was deafening. Ethan stood, his eyes darting around in desperation as he tried to gather himself. Sophie, please, he began, his voice shaky. I can explain. Explain? Sophie interrupted, her gaze steady and unwavering. You mean lie, just like you've been doing since we met? Her voice was cold, devoid of the emotion that Ethan had expected to hear. There was no place for excuses. No room for regret. She had seen the truth. And it was too late for him to change that. The room erupted into murmurs of disbelief and shock. But Sophie remained calm. This, she said, is the man I trusted to be my partner. She pointed at Chloe. And this, she added, is the woman he chose to betray me with. Chloe bolted from the room, her heels clicking loudly as she fled, while Ethan hesitated for a moment before following her, looking more like a scolded child than the man who had once projected such confidence. Sophie stood tall, her composure intact, as she turned to face the guests. I apologize for this disruption, she said, but I felt it was important to reveal the truth. Trust is not something to be taken lightly, and I refuse to allow deceit to tarnish my family's legacy. The applause that followed was slow at first, then grew louder, as the guests showed their support for Sophie. The weight of the betrayal was finally lifted from her shoulders. She had faced the truth, and now, she was ready to move forward. As the evening drew to a close, Sophie stood alone in the quiet of her family estate, the echoes of the night's revelations still reverberating in her mind. The faces of the guests lingered in her thoughts, the looks of shock and admiration mixed with the weight of the betrayal she had just exposed. She had made her statement, but it wasn't just for them. It was for herself. She had reclaimed her dignity, her power, and most importantly, her future. Outside, the cold night air brushed against Sophie's skin, but the chill didn't touch her. She had faced the storm head-on and come out stronger. Ethan's deception no longer had any hold on her. She had learned that day just how powerful it was to stand up for herself, to trust her instincts, and to cut ties with those who would try to manipulate her for their own gain. It was a painful process, but it was a necessary one. Sophie knew that she could no longer live in a world where trust was only a currency to be exchanged when it suited someone else. She had spent too long trying to live up to the expectations of others, to the point where she nearly lost herself in the process. But tonight, she had found her true self again. She wasn't just Sophie Matthews, the woman everyone admired from a distance. She was a force to be reckoned with. And she wasn't about to let anyone, especially Ethan, define her. The days following the public revelation were filled with meetings with lawyers, paperwork, and phone calls with family. Sophie's life was consumed by the logistics of securing her inheritance and ensuring that nothing Ethan could do would ever touch her wealth again. But even in the midst of all that, her mind often wandered back to Ethan's face that night. The panic in his eyes when the recordings were played, and the way he tried to salvage his reputation, even as it crumbled in front of him. Ethan's fall from grace had been swift and brutal. The media had picked up the story in a frenzy, detailing every detail of his betrayal, his manipulation, and his affair with Chloe. The headlines were unforgiving. Businessman exposed for deceit and infidelity. Husband of billionaire heiress caught trying to steal family wealth. Ethan had quickly gone from a man admired for his charm and ambition to a pariah in the eyes of the very society he had once been a part of. He had tried to salvage his reputation, calling in favors, but it was no use. The people he once considered allies turned their backs on him, too disgusted by his actions to lend a hand. His phone had stopped ringing, his business deals falling apart one by one. The lifestyle he had dreamed of, the luxury and wealth he thought he could claim by marrying Sophie, slipped away from him like sand through his fingers. Sophie watched all of this unfold from a distance, her heart untouched by the chaos Ethan was experiencing. She had no sympathy for him. Not anymore. She had been the one who had been deceived, the one who had been used as a stepping stone for his ambitions. But watching him unravel also gave Sophie a sense of closure. She had been right about him all along. Meanwhile, Sophie's life had taken on a new rhythm. The media, once focused on her wedding and her inheritance, now praised her for her strength and resilience. She had become a symbol of empowerment, an example of a woman who refused to be controlled, who took her fate into her own hands, and who protected what was rightfully hers. She had grown stronger in the face of betrayal, and now, she was using her platform to advocate for women's independence and self-worth. Sophie began speaking at events, sharing her story with others who had gone through similar experiences. Her words resonated with many, and soon, she became a sought-after speaker on topics of personal empowerment and financial independence. She used her family's wealth not just for herself, but to help others, to create foundations that would lift those who had been left behind by a system that didn't always work in their favor. Through it all, Ethan's name continued to fade into obscurity. The media's attention shifted, and the man who had once been the center of every conversation became a mere footnote in the stories of those who had come after him. His phone calls to Sophie went unanswered. His desperate attempts to reach her met with cold silence. Sophie knew she had made the right choice. She had chosen herself. She had chosen to rise above the chaos he had brought into her life. And with every step forward, she felt more at peace. The future was hers to shape. As the days passed, Sophie continued to thrive. The pain of betrayal no longer lingered in her heart. Instead, she had found strength in the journey she had undertaken. Every decision she made was now guided by her own values, her own desires, not by the expectations of others. She was no longer the woman who sought approval, she was the woman who commanded respect. Sophie had not just rebuilt her life, but reshaped it entirely, turning her story of loss and betrayal into one of empowerment and success. Ethan, on the other hand, had become a shadow of the man he once was. His life had crumbled beyond repair. His name dragged through the mud. His wealth lost to his own greed. Sophie had become the symbol of resilience, her face a beacon for others who had been hurt and betrayed. Her journey wasn't just about reclaiming her fortune, but reclaiming her dignity, her independence, and her future. Sophie's story had taught her, and the world, a profound lesson: never let anyone diminish your worth. And never allow someone else's ambition to steal your happiness. Trust is a sacred bond, and betrayal is the ultimate violation of that bond. But it is through such pain that we find the strength to rise, to rebuild, and to thrive. As Sophie stood on the balcony of her family estate, overlooking the city she had once feared to navigate alone, she knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. Her legacy was no longer defined by what she had inherited, but by what she had built with her own hands. Thank you for following Sophie's story. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel to keep up with more captivating life stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for more inspiring tales.